Hey y'all, this is Aaron Munoz again with Out and Loud, Florida. And I'd like to talk about a little bit of transgender vocabulary 101, if you will. So the word transgender or trans has been circulating a lot lately between social media and mainstream media and general conversations among the general public. It's important that when we're talking about trans people, that we are respectful in knowing how to do so and knowing the proper terminology. Just like when you speak about sexuality or race, you want to make sure that you are speaking from a place of being informed and being respectful and not using any ignorant language that may be offensive or just simply make you sound like you don't know what you're talking about. So, transgender, there's no ED on the end. Trans is short for transgender. A person who is transgender simply means that their gender identity, the gender with which they live in their mind, heart, and soul, if you will, is different from that gender which was assigned to them at birth based on their genitalia. Now, it is true that most men have penises, and it is true that most women have vaginas. However, just like with any other biological or scientific commonality, there are always variations. So someone who is trans, identifies as transgender, was assigned a gender based on whatever genitalia they may or may not have been born with, and then realized once they were mature enough and self-aware enough that that designation was incorrect. Now, a lot of people have been asking about the word cisgender or cis. Cisgender is simply the opposite of transgender. It's a word that comes from the Latin word cis, C-I-S, which means same. So cisgender, same gender, means that you identify with the same gender that you were assigned at birth based on your body type. Now, let's talk about the word transsexual. Transsexual was a word that was commonly used for the trans community, and in many cases used by trans people for themselves. That word is considered outdated and may be taken as offensive if someone who's not trans refers to trans people that way. So if you yourself are not trans, I would avoid using the word transsexual and instead stick with transgender. If someone self-identifies as transsexual and asks to be called that, then that's a different story. But that's only going to be for them to decide and isn't really a good blanket term to be using for the community, as some might take offense or see it as being outdated. Now, the term intersex. This is the I in the LGBTQIA that you tend to see. I stands for intersex, which means that the person may have been born with a set of genitalia that was not necessarily classified under strictly inherently male or strictly inherently female. Intersex folks are a walking example of the fact that gender and biological sex, quote unquote, if you will, all exist on a spectrum, and that not everyone can be put into one box or the other. Now, unfortunately, a lot of intersex folks are subject to forced surgeries at birth because doctors and parents want them to have either, quote unquote, one or the other, and it can actually end up being very damaging. And a lot of these, many of these intersex folks, I don't know the statistics, but many of these intersex folks end up identifying as some variation of transgender or as flat out transgender later on in life because they realize that the corrective surgery that was done on them didn't reflect who they actually were. Now, the term non-binary refers to the idea that there are definitely more than two gender identities existing in humanity. Most cultures outside of the Western culture that we're used to have honored and identified and acknowledged multiple different gender identities, more than two, for a long time. So non-binary gender is very simply a gender that doesn't fall in the binary choice of male or female. Within the term non-binary, that can kind of be an umbrella term for many different gender identities and different labels that people may choose to self-identify. You may have heard terms such as genderqueer, or agender, meaning without a gender, or two-spirit, which is a Native American cultural phrase that refers to someone who embodies more than one energy as far as gender. So non-binary is a way to describe all of the genders that are not strictly male or strictly female, as fall into the kind of Western American idea of binary gender that has been pushed on us for so long. I believe it's true that there are probably a lot more people who would identify as non-binary if they were as reflective as they felt they could be and not pushed into one box or the other from birth. If you hear a word that you're not necessarily familiar with that has to do with gender, because there are plenty of labels that people might choose to use for themselves to help them better explain how they feel or better navigate the dating scene or better discuss their issues with friends, etc. So if you see a word like this that you don't necessarily recognize or that I didn't mention here, feel free to Google it. You'd be really surprised that when you Google a word such as genderqueer or non-binary gender, you can actually find sometimes blogs from trans people who identify with these terms, who can explain it to you on their best terms. And who knows, you may find a label that you didn't know that you identified with. Now, before I go, let me just run over a few of the words you don't want to be saying. And I'm going to go ahead and put a trigger warning right here for the explicit content, so to speak, or the offensive slurs that I'm going to mention that I really, really, really need you to avoid if you want to be respectful of trans people. The words tranny, she-male, man in a dress, these are all offensive, harmful to trans women. These all perpetuate the idea that trans women are not actually women, which is incredibly false. And it perpetuates the dehumanization of trans women, which is incredibly violent. The word hermaphrodite is another outdated, offensive term that we no longer say. The phrases such as used to be a woman, or was born a man, or switching genders, or sex change. These are all, again, problematic ways to describe the intense and gradual and difficult journey that a trans person has to take in order to be and live as who they really are. We refer to this as transitioning. So a person who's transitioning may be changing their name and pronouns. They may be coming out to their entire friends and family. They may be taking hormones or preparing for surgeries. There are a lot of different ways which trans people transition, and not all trans people have the same surgeries. Not all trans people take the same hormones. The journey is different for everyone, just like manhood or womanhood is different for anyone. I hope this cleared up some of the confusion with some of the vocabulary and how to respectfully talk about trans and intersex and non-binary people so that we can continue to have good dialogue and constructive conversation without getting caught up in sounding ignorant or sounding offensive because we don't know the proper terminology to respectfully refer to one another. I'll drop a link below for you to leave your anonymous questions, and I will be addressing them here forward, either myself or other trans men, women, and non-binary folks associated with Out and Loud, Florida. So if you've got a question related to gender that you're afraid to ask, drop it in the anonymous link and we will do our best to answer it for you. Be kind to one another.